We're thrilled to have with us this afternoon two Institute experts who really need no introduction, and that's not a euphemism, David Makovsky and Dennis Ross. David and Dennis were originally scheduled to discuss their trips to Israel, its neighbors, against the background of the killing of Iranian General Qassem Soleimani. I am sure they will now have substantial and additional comments on the Trump peace plan. David and Dennis are two of the Institute's most veteran scholars. Dennis, the William Davidson Distinguished Fellow, was author of the Institute's very first policy paper. He has served in 5 presidential administrations and worked directly with 3 presidents. Remarkably, in a bygone era, he worked with both Republican and Democratic presidents. David, who is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow, was an award-winning journalist before joining the Institute. He spent from 2013 to 2014 in the office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Dennis and David are the authors, most recently, of the excellent book, Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. David is also the moderator of a new podcast series, Decision Points, which provides fresh insights into critical moments in the U.S.-Israel relationship from prominent historians and policymakers. The Levy family is proud that Dennis and David are both associated with the Institute's Irwin Levy Family Program on the U.S.-Israel strategic relationship. So I am happy to turn the call over to Dennis and David.
Thank you.
David, have you joined?
I don't know if David's not on. I will just start, okay?
Sounds good.
Okay, so look, as Mark said, originally the two of us were going to talk about the trips that we've just had out to the region, which were extremely interesting, and I'm sure you'd like to hear about it, but it's not what you want to hear about right now. So why don't I talk about what you probably are most interested in hearing about, which is the Trump plan, talk about what I will say what's interesting about it and what may be problematic about it. When we get into the Q&A, we can discuss more of this, but we can also discuss some of the things that each of us found during our time in the region. So let me just start by saying this was a plan that was a long time coming. It took 3 years to develop it. The timing was clearly a surprise. There was a presumption that the plan would not be issued until after the upcoming Israeli election on March 2nd. I think it's probably fair to say that the timing of the plan was heavily influenced by political considerations, one of which was undoubtedly what's going on here, and one of which is also undoubtedly what was going on as of yesterday. You were supposed to have, or at the time of the plan was announced, that was supposed to be the day that immunity for the prime minister was going to be debated within the Knesset. What you had with the plan is, at least in Israel, the focus on immunity disappeared, and of course the prime minister then decided to drop his request for immunity, which then led the Attorney General to immediately proceed to announce that he was proceeding with the indictment. So the timing was probably governed by a set of political considerations. But the plan itself had been developed over time. Now the plan has the administration outlining what would be a 2-state outcome. This is interesting because this is an administration that had been reluctant to commit to a 2-state outcome. It had been basically saying, look, whatever the parties can agree to. And here, there's no doubt, especially when you read it, that there is a commitment to a 2-state outcome. It is a plan that is based heavily on Israeli security needs. This Palestinian state would be surrounded by Israel. The only borders it would have would be with Israel. It would not have a border with Jordan. In a sense, the map shows it would be encircled by Israel. The plan also provides for the state, but that it also is trisected. because a large number of settlements, I'll give you the exact number, it's actually 62 settlements that are outside of the settlement blocks. I think you've heard both of us talk about the blocks for a long time. The blocks are those settlements that are built most closely to the Green Line. The truth is 87% of all the Israeli settlers live in the area that is closest to the Green Line, closest to the major urban centers in Israel. This is on about up to 5 or 6% of the West Bank, because the blocks themselves have never been actually defined specifically. When we talk about this, both David and I talk about this is the area that's on about 8% of the West Bank, with the security barrier being the point of delineation. There are 55 settlements in the block areas. They represent the vast majority, as I said, of Israeli settlers, but there are 62 settlements on the other side of the security barrier, outside the settlement blocks, that would be incorporated into Israel in the Trump plan. Because they're being incorporated into Israel, you are also breaking up what otherwise would be more of a continuous area for a Palestinian state in the West Bank. Now, from an Israeli standpoint, not only does that meet the concerns of the vast majority of settlers, but it also, given this role of dividing up the Palestinian, what would be the Palestinian state, and surrounding it, so that there is no border with Jordan, but Israel is in the Jordan Valley, that goes a long ways towards meeting Israeli security needs. Moreover, the plan itself, when it comes to the security arrangements, pretty much puts Israel in a position where those arrangements and how long they last are entirely up to Israel. There is in the plan a statement that says the Israeli presence in places could be reduced over time as Palestinian security forces do more and improve their effectiveness, but the Palestinian state will be demilitarized. Israel will retain overriding security responsibility for the entire area of the West Bank, while, again, that could be modified over time. It is Israel that determines whether the benchmarks that are to be established and to be discussed in what would be a three-way committee, in the end, the ultimate arbiter of whether those benchmarks have been met is Israel. That does represent, it's one of the areas where there is a significant change from all previous proposals. It is true that in the past when we developed proposals, we had target dates for when there might be Israeli withdrawal. We had performance criteria, but Israel wasn't the sole arbiter of whether or not the performance criteria would be met. So Israel will control all the airspace. Israel will control the electromagnetic spectrum. Israel will control, in a sense, all the crossing points. Again, some of this can be modified over time, but it remains up to Israel to determine whether they're satisfied with the performance. Number one. Number two, the Palestinian state itself cannot come into being not only until there's satisfaction on the security arrangements. There also has to be complete demilitarization of Gaza, meaning Hamas somehow will have to be removed within Gaza. There also has to be a reform within the Palestinian Authority, meaning there has to be institution building, a rule of law. There has to be economic reforms that creates transparency for financial institutions. In effect, there is a pretty significant set of benchmarks or criteria that must be met before the Palestinians will get to the fact where they would have a state. Their state would be on about 60% of the West Bank. There is swap areas. There will be parts of Israel next to Gaza that would increase the overall size of the Palestinian state. What was said in the plan is that this would be roughly comparable to the size of the territories pre-67, but that's not, when you actually look at the maps, that's not the case. You're going to end up with 60%, roughly 60% of the West Bank, and then you'll have these areas next to Gaza that would expand the size of Gaza, and it's taking it from the western Negev. And these are, the exact size will be limited by the topography there, and the exact size would be probably end up with about 80% overall. So this is what the two-state outcome could look like. There are, I should flag, obviously, some of the problems here. The first issue that I would say is a potential problem relates to the areas that will become part of Israel. We've seen already the indication that the Israelis feel that they have the go-ahead to annex them immediately. So there's a kind of built-in kind of tension here. The president said in his speech that this was a vision. There was a 4-year timetable. He expected the Palestinians to say to reject it up front, but they would have 4 years to basically negotiate it. Consider again what this had to offer, because there are a lot of economic inducements, assuming Palestinians take a series of measures. It's the $50 billion that is talked about. There's no discussion of where that money will come from or who will provide it, but it's there in theory. It waits reforms from the Palestinians, but in a sense, the Palestinian state couldn't come into being until all these various criteria have been met somewhere down the road. You can start with the issue of Gaza. Nobody at this point has the means to disarm or demilitarize Gaza, so it's not clear at all when that would happen. When the president talks about a 4-year timetable, but if the Israelis go on annex immediately, it looks like the Israelis can front-load everything, and what the Palestinians get may or may not ever be realized. So as you might imagine, there are critics who are saying, look, how real is that going to be? A second potential problem is that it's not just that the Palestinians, not unexpectedly, rejected this, but I can tell you, I was with a senior Arab official who I had been discussing the plan prior to its release. I had been discussing with the administration, had they really done their homework with the key Arabs so that they would respond by saying something about how the plan is serious, and I was told that the key Arabs had been given the broad outlines of the plan but hadn't been given the details. With this key Arab official that I was meeting with, he told me that, and I'm not going to get into which country it was, he said they were prepared to say that the plan was serious, which, if you think about it, when key Arab countries say the plan is serious, even though Abu Mazen, they knew was bound to reject it, the fact that they say it also increases the prospects that you can get the Europeans to go along with what the Arabs are saying. The Europeans don't have to be more Arab than the Arabs, so if they say it's serious and the Arabs are saying it's serious, that can put a lot of pressure on the Palestinians. You know, for the Palestinians, the one thing they collectively think that they have achieved is international acceptance of their cause. If it looks like they're adopting a rejectionist position, and the Europeans and the Arabs are saying we may have questions about the plan, but we think it's a serious basis for negotiations, that puts the Palestinians in a very difficult position, one that I will tell you would be very hard for them to sustain. So this Arab official I was with, when we sat down together and we looked at the map, he said the map does make it impossible for us. And he said, look, he actually asked me what they should say in response, and I made the point, why don't you just focus on the importance of direct negotiations now, which in fact, this is exactly what Egypt and Saudi Arabia said. They even said it could be under American auspices. None of the Arab responders came back and had a comment on the content of the plan. The important thing here to note is None of them rejected the plan, but none of them commented on the plan. None of them endorsed the plan. They all came back by basically saying there should be direct negotiations, which in itself is extraordinary if you think about it. To have key Arab states emphasizing the importance of direct negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians was hardly the norm. In addition to that, you have the Palestinians, you have Abu Mazen coming out and saying 1,000 times no to this, and they're not following the Palestinian lead. This is a significant departure, again, historically. What it tells you is there's a very interesting potential to do more with the Arabs. What, unfortunately, was hard for them to embrace was a map that makes it look like this is a very hard case to suggest that this is a Palestinian state that could look credible, and even then, what is available to the Palestinians is unlikely to be available for several years. So the critical thing here, and David's on the line right now, so I'll just go on for a couple more minutes and then I'll turn it over to him. We wrote an article in the Washington Post where we singled out, if this plan is to have any hope, if there's any possibility of not losing the Arabs, it is essential that the Israelis not go ahead and unilaterally annex the areas that are allotted to them. It creates, again, the imagery. Supposedly, the president says there's a 4-year timetable here, but the Israelis are preempting on the one hand, and the Palestinians have some promise somewhere down the road. I mean, it's kind of the flip side of what we used to always say about the Arabs. You go back to the Arab Peace Initiative that was adopted in 1982. They promised, in return for the Israelis withdrawing from all the territories back to June 4, 1967, they promised a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But this is at the same time that bombs are going off in Israel, and they can't condemn that. So you have the image of something promised somewhere down the road that isn't all that tangible, isn't all that firm. In the meantime, you want something up front. And the key here is to take advantage of what is clearly a change in the region where Arab leaders are signaling they will not automatically follow the Palestinian lead on the Palestinian issue. That is a huge development, and it is something not to be squandered. Annexation would force their hand. Right now, they're on the fence where they can't embrace the plan as it is because in a sense, it's offering, in a sense, too little to the Palestinians. Had you had a plan that offered, say, 85 to 90% of the West Bank to the Palestinians, my sense is we actually would have seen a readiness to actually make favorable comments about the plan itself by the Arabs. When it's 60% that's being offered, when it's a map that they can't easily defend, the fact that they adopted this position that is not critical of the plan but basically avoids commenting on it is itself, I think, a significant development, and it is something that I think the right kind of policy now by the administration, lean on the Israelis not to annex, and we've already seen some backtracking in this regard. David Friedman, the ambassador, said the Israelis could annex immediately, and then later he gave, after Jared Kushner gave an interview where he said nothing will happen before the Israeli election. At least they backed off of that. Jason Greenblatt said, committees have to be formed. It'll take some time. I would say they need to go beyond that because that still implies that within a couple of months you could have annexation. This plan is not going to be realized anytime soon, and ultimately, if it can't be realized at all, there is a danger that you get right back into a one-state outcome. When you have 62 settlements outside of the settlement blocks that are being absorbed into Israel, if this can't be the basis for two states and this isn't going to be translated and Israel falls back into being one state, then you have one state for two people, and the Palestinians will revert to saying, fine, one state, one person, one vote. So this is a plan that the premise of two states is an important thing because it can maintain the possibility of that as an outcome. I think the most important thing is for the administration itself to continue to emphasize what the president said. This is a vision. There's a 4-year window here. Vision, by definition, means there can be some adjustments. Hold up on unilateral steps on either side, and keep the Arabs on board. And this will be my last comment, so I'll turn it over to David. The one way to move the Palestinians is to show that they're isolated, precisely because of what I said before, that they're jeopardizing the kind of support they've had internationally. They will not move otherwise. If annexation forces the hand of the Arabs and the Arabs go ahead and basically have to join them in the rejection of the plan, and then the Europeans join them in the rejection of the plan, then you'll see an effort to isolate us and the Israelis and not them. Moving the Palestinians isn't going to come through persuasion right now. It's going to come because it becomes clear to them that they're losing those who have always been their main supporters. That also is not something that will turn around overnight, but it takes advantage of what is a signal development in the region that Arab leaders are not automatically following the Palestinians any longer, and that can be a wake-up call for the Palestinians. Okay, I'll stop there and let David chime in.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. And I think I heard you almost from the beginning, and I was very good on all the numbers on the maps. I was very impressed. So I don't have to do a lot of that number crunching this time, but happy in the discussion afterwards to address some of the finer points on the maps themselves. Look, I think Dennis's point about that this is a first. It's not like Sadat broke from an Arab consensus, but we've never seen an Arab consensus kind of break from the Palestinians in a massive way. I think this is really the first time in 70 years, in terms of the history of the conflict, that there has been such a divergence between the Arab states and the Palestinian Authority. And Dennis's point at the end about the only hope to move the Palestinians is if they think they're isolated from the Arab states. But the annexation issue really could flip the script and then isolate Israel and the United States. And that would really be a gift to Abbas. I think that point really needs to be understood. That's why Dennis and I wrote our piece that's this morning in the Washington Post, that an early annexation takes a very fragile situation that the Arab states are in a position they're not used to. Because why have they shifted? Because they've got other fish to fry. The Iran issue, they see Israel as an ally, and as an opportunity, not as a threat. They might need Israel if the U.S. withdraws from the Middle East. There's other priorities they have: Yemen, Libya, closer ties with the United States. This isn't at the top of their list, but they're in an uncomfortable position. And the Arab League foreign ministers meeting on Saturday is a key moment in time. Talking to the White House a few days ago, it was clear that they did not want annexation to happen, but something happened in the day before or the day of the ceremony. And I tend to believe, and when I don't have proof, I have to say I don't have proof, but I think that Netanyahu must have come to town. He got a little worried about the enclaves, the 15 settlements in the Palestinian area could not grow. And that would be, they use the word freeze, a land freeze that has certain connotations as if he's calling for a across-the-board freeze, which isn't what it is, and said, well, if I have to commit to a freeze, even a very limited one, I want to be able, he's running for election, and he wants to be able to show instant results before the election of a mass annexation. And that was something the White House did not want, in my view, but that Trump or Friedman seemed to acquiesce towards. But it became clear that this was, I think, a bridge too far. Dennis is right to point to the Friedman comment. The shift, the day it happened, Israel could do whatever it wants. The next day, well, there needs to be a committee. We have to study it. Jason Greenblatt saying, with all these settlements, we have to make sure our coordinates on the map and the coordinates of the annexation are in sync. And I think the reality of this Arab League meeting on Saturday meant that this fragile gain of getting the Arabs not to cling to the Palestinian position, but for the first time to to pursue an independent course, suddenly I think came home to them, and they reverted back to their initial opposition. I agree with Dennis, it's not enough, but it's an important step because even if we talk about the Jordan Valley, you can get some very belligerent talk from Jordan, how this could lead to a suspension in the treaty from press reports. But I think that without the annexation piece right now, people will be able to digest this and give this plan a chance to sink in. I get asked all the time in the last 48 hours, what drives Trump? Why is he doing this whole thing? And I think I would look at two different things here, two different rationales that are not mutually exclusive. Rationale one, I think he wants this to be a point of reference, that there had been 3 U.S. peace plans. There had been the Clinton parameters that Dennis was a part of. There had been the Condoleezza Rice Annapolis proposals in 2007 and 8, the effort I was a part of with Kerry 2013-14. And this would be a reset button that would be used by future administrations in terms of these final status issues, that the baseline would not be blocks and swaps that would net out on a one-to-one basis around 100% of the land, but now we're talking about 60% of the land. And instead of 77 settlements being moved, not one would be moved. How that's going to work on the ground, I think, is going to be a real challenge. Whether this really creates a one-state situation, I'm sure there'll be a massive debate about that. But I think that this point that not just a reference point for other administrations, but if they are elected in a second term, that the Palestinians would maybe come to reconcile that these guys are going to be around for 4 more years, and their boycott since 2017 is unsustainable, and they would maybe come around to a Trump plan approach. The other way to do it is to take a few steps further and to say, look, yeah, of course, if the Palestinians come around, but, are the chances of that high? Their self-definition is one of defiance. Therefore, assume that they're not going to take advantage of this. And what you're saying is, if you miss this opportunity, you have a tacit U.S.-Israel understanding about a map. And so if the old approach was always that Israel is offered the promise of peace while giving the tangibles of territory, now the switch is flipped. Israel is given the tangibles of territory, and the Palestinians, as Dennis pointed out, have a lot of conditionality to go to see if this state is ever formed or not. So I think that this is all premised on Trump being reelected. If he's not reelected, I don't think the shelf life of this plan is going to be necessarily that long, but we'll need to see. In the conversations, I'm happy to get into some of the technical points. I might have missed at the very beginning if you said anything about Jerusalem, which is different than Dennis mentioned. The West Bank. This would move the line in Jerusalem into a different place. Most of the Palestinians live in neighborhoods in East Jerusalem that are within the barrier of Jerusalem, but now it would be outside the barrier, north of Jerusalem. Some of you have come with me and with Dennis and Dave Pollack and Rob to Ramallah know that there's like a no man's zone in northern Jerusalem, and that would be where Al-Quds, the Palestinian capital, will be. This is a map that was, Rob talked about how rare it is that an American map is put forward. It's the only time. But this is a map that Trump said is an Israeli map, that he said that this was Netanyahu's map. And I will say, to be fair to Netanyahu, that it is the first time that the Likud, again, there hasn't been a vote yet, he gave a Bar Ilan speech before about 2 states, but he didn't produce a map, and Likud nor the cabinet endorsed the speech. And this will be the first time that I think we'll be seeing a Likud map, a Likud endorsement of 2 states. It's not the 40% of Naftali Bennett, A plus B, meaning the Palestinian cities and the environs, but it's at least 60%. It has an element in here that's going to spark controversy. Thanks to the website of the Institute, we're able to actually do an overlay of the White House's map, and it's clear that part of this map is about Israeli Arabs in the northwest right out corner of the West Bank, just on the Israel Green Line side, for the first time, means that Israeli Arabs could be in play. That's 250,000 people. We've delineated it on the tweets of how many Israeli Arabs would be affected. The map does say, and the plan does say, that this will be up to the Palestinians themselves. I know it says it'll be up to the parties. It doesn't define the parties. Is the parties Israel and Palestine, or do the Israeli Arabs get a vote if they are gerrymandered out of Israel into Palestine? This is controversial. The mayors of the Israeli Arab towns have said they're dead against it, saying we're citizens, you can't disenfranchise us. So that's another element for you to look at. I'll just say one more. I could go on for hours, but I want to have the discussion, so I want to be short. I would just say one more element to look at is also the politics in Israel and how the intersection between policy and politics. Maybe Netanyahu will not be able to do an annexation before the election, but he's been able to change the channel. This was going to be a third round of elections, which was going to be about does he get immunity, not get immunity, and it's clear he was not going to get immunity. He waited to withdraw his request till Gantz's plane, left American airspace, and then he pulled his request for the Knesset meeting where Gantz was supposed to, be involved in. So he's not going to be immune. That means he will face a court. He'll be, if he's elected, he'll be in court in the morning and run the country in the afternoon, proverbially. But we'll have to see. But I think by doing this, he has clearly helped shift the frame of this election to being, I'm the guy who worked with Trump assiduously, for the last 3 years, and I have shifted the goalposts of the United States on what was traditional peacemaking. That's helped him. I've looked at the polls. Always be wary of instant polls. But it's cut the deficit that he had, but it has not yet appreciably shifted the terms of the overall blocks in the Israeli elections. It's still way too close to call. But for Netanyahu, he would have assumed that if he was, that if the headlines were going to be Prime Minister, will not get immunity, that his position would have deteriorated. Now he will feel I've stopped the slide, and so I think for politically so far it's been useful for him, and he's been able to say we're actually behind a peace plan, and it's very precise, and be able to showcase his friendship with Trump. So I just think that's another angle to look at is the politics and that nexus point between policy and politics in Israel. But I'm happy to go into I love dealing with the maps and the finer points of the maps, but I don't want to talk too long. So why don't I stop here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay. So we're open to take your questions.
Thank you. If you wish to ask a question at this time, you can do so by pressing star 1 on your telephone keypad. That's star 1 for questions. We'll take our first question. Caller, your line is open. Please go ahead. Go ahead, caller. Your line is open.
Hello. Is my line open?
We hear you.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
We hear you.
I don't know. They said my line is open, but I can't.
We hear you. Go ahead.
We hear you.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. This is very, very interesting. Denny, I had difficulty hearing you. I think my line is open because I clicked earlier to say please talk louder, but it didn't work. It sounds to me as if the Arab world outside of Palestinians is anxious not to line up with the Palestinians, not to give them backing, and yet doesn't want to approve the plan. Am I correct? And that's your read of it?
Yes. Yeah. That's the problem. Is one of the things I was saying is that I was actually with an Arab official from a country that had been prepared to be more forward-leaning, and it would have been surprising to people had they been there. and yet, and I was with this official when we saw the map together, and he said they just that was it. They couldn't embrace the plan, but they wouldn't criticize it. He actually asked me, what should they say? And I suggested, why don't you say that what's very important is that there be direct negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So you won't be critical of the plan. You don't have to comment on it. You're emphasizing direct negotiations at the very moment that Abu Mazen is emphasizing rejection. It'll show the clear distinction from Abu Mazen. And the most important thing right now, especially if Palestinians are to be affected over time, is to see they're alone and that no one's following them. And that's what we've seen. So the good news is that the Arabs we have, the Arab states that are out there, including even, by the way, Qatar, the ones that are out there that basically all adopt this position are Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar, although they did mention the 67 lines, and Jordan did as well, but nobody commented on it, and Morocco as well. So none of them commented on the plan. We did have one comment from the UAE ambassador to Washington, who did say it was a serious initiative and it was a beginning. That wasn't echoed by anyone else. That was the only comment that seemed to relate directly to the plan itself. The rest, however, were designed, I think, mostly to show them not being critical of the plan, but not being able to embrace it either. And I think what both David and I are saying is what we also wrote in our piece. This is a huge development. I mean, it's very hard to exaggerate the significance of this. I can tell you from my experience, we used to always hear from the Arabs in private, well, we'll tell the Palestinians to do something, and then of course, whatever would happen is that they would then fall in line behind the Palestinians. My favorite example of this was in the year 2000. Arafat at one point asked me if I could help organize an Arab foreign ministers meeting because they weren't responding to him. And he said to me, I want to organize a meeting so that they will support my ability to negotiate. So I said, okay. And I went ahead and I organized it. And then I got a call from one of the Arab foreign ministers there. He said, look, we came, but Arafat is adopting all these maximal resolutions, and of course we don't have a choice but to support him. Well, we're seeing a sea change right now, and that's something not to be lost. That's something to be developed.
Okay, then is it possible that this situation could lead to negotiations?
The answer is over time, yes. But that also gets back to the issue of annexation. If there's an immediate annexation, one of the things it does is it looks like it preempts everything.
Well, if he doesn't try to do that immediately, but he says, I'm going to do it, and meanwhile we're going to have negotiations, would that be a concession on the part of the Israelis as well as on the part of the Arabs?
Look, I think, if the administration continues to emphasize the importance of the negotiations and basically looks like it's convinced the Israelis to hold off annexation, then I think we could be in business. Not immediately, but we could be in business. It'll take time. Look, one interesting potential change. David was describing how the political landscape has changed because of what's happened. My guess is that we have increased the prospects of there being a national unity government. You have Blue-White now introducing the peace plan to the Knesset for endorsement. And that may create more of a justification for there to be a national unity government. One of the things that Gantz is saying is that there should be no steps taken prior to the election, and then he's saying, I think I mentioned it, that we should be working in coordination with the Egyptians and Jordanians, and we should be talking to the Palestinians. Well, if you begin to see those kinds of changes, and the administration works, I think, diligently behind the scenes, And I was just, in a meeting with three of the European political directors, and one of the things I was expressing to them was where the Arabs were, and that if they and the Arabs would both support the notion of talks, what that would do is, again, it puts the Palestinians in a position where they're all alone. Hard to sustain the position when they're all alone. This again creates a new opportunity if you know how to seize it.
This could be an exciting, positive moment.
It could be.
Can we take our next question, please?
Yes. So we'll move to our next question. Caller, your line is open. Please go ahead.
Hi. If Trump is not reelected, will future administrations be bound by Trump's plan, especially as it relates to Israel annexing any land? And what has been the reaction of the Democrats, especially of the candidates? And which of the Democratic candidates do you believe will be the most pro-Israel? And on the flip side, which one should Jews in Israel be concerned about?
You packed a lot in on that one.
Right?
You want to do it, David? You want me to do it? What do you want?
I'll start.
Why don't you go ahead? You start.
So I think that because the Democrats have been very critical of this plan, and I think it's all what I was trying to say about Trump's approach. Either it's a point of reference where the Palestinians come around, and if they don't come around, it sets the baseline, the predicate for a U.S.-Israel understanding on annexation if it hasn't been done until then. I tend to think that it will not be, if nothing really moves forward on this, there'll be elements that the Democrats are gonna disavow. Just as I would, point out that even annexation has not been irreversible. In 1981, Israel said it was going to apply Israeli law on the Golan Heights, but in 92 to 2000, Israel, the governments of Rabin, Peretz, Netanyahu, and Barak all negotiated on the Golan with Syria. So I tend to think that the Democrats will not see this as irreversible. It doesn't mean that every element that Trump does, they're going to put back. Like, I don't see the embassy going back to Tel Aviv or the Golan being unrecognized. But I think that there are elements of this plan, because of their being controversial, that the Democrats will not feel bound by. But I defer to you, Dennis, if you see it differently, and if you want to wade into the question about the candidates.
I guess I would say two things. Here again, it gets back to the discussion we just had. If it turns out that the Trump administration is able to do something between now and the end of the year where it looks like the Arabs and even the Europeans are basically saying, let's emphasize negotiations, it probably produces some degree of caution on the part if there's a different administration. If, on the other hand, annexation proceeds, then you're going to see a kind of wholesale reversal, and we'll see the pattern that we've seen. Look, when Bush came in, he reversed everything with Clinton. When Obama came in, he reversed everything with Bush. When Trump came in, he reversed everything with Obama. There'll be a very strong impulse to reverse across the board. So that's why I say if there's something that's happening out there in the region, that's a little different because it creates a reality that the administration then has to respond to. All right, I would characterize, and I'm speaking analytically now, okay? I'm just, based on what I know about the positions, I would say Sanders is the one who is probably has the toughest views towards Israel. Warren, until this year, had views that seemed much more centrist on Israel, but she seems to have moved during the course of the campaign. The others are all inherently much more centrist towards Israel. Mayor Pete, Amy Klobuchar, Biden and Bloomberg are probably all more inclined to look at some of the nuances of the positions. And I would say Bloomberg would probably be the one most inclined to be heavily focused on Israeli security. Biden, I think, would be close to that. And I think Buttigieg and Klobuchar would not be far from that, but they're probably not quite in the same positions. But I would group them that way.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move to our next question. Go ahead, caller. Your line is open.
Hi, Steve Daniels in West Palm Beach. How much or how little do the financial aspects of the plan weigh on the Palestinians?
On this one, I would just say the financial dimensions were kind of clear at the Bahrain conference in June. I was there. The White House asked me to come, and I came. This $50 billion is not grants. A lot of it is soft loans and fees and all sorts of things. But the Palestinians often did not always seem to be driven by, practical economic incentives. They tend to think you're trying to buy them. Abbas keeps saying, I will not sell the homeland. So I tend to think that while economics myself, I think, is crucial for any resolution of this conflict and should not be relegated to the margins, when it comes up against the big core issues like Jerusalem and the borders, there's a tendency on the Palestinian side that says you want to buy us. And I wrote a piece in the Washington Post last summer after I came back from Bahrain that I feel that whenever it's all or nothing in the Mideast, it's nothing. And if the approach of Trump was maximal pressure, you don't get a penny. But if you sign what I want you to sign, you get everything. They tend to say, we don't sign. And I tend to think that, you should know that all or nothing is nothing. And you should not try to find a way that that it would be better off with people on the ground if we're not taking away money from hospitals in East Jerusalem, that they actually think we care about them. And that doesn't mean to keep UNRWA. It doesn't mean to keep the status quo. And maybe some of these were useful correctives, but there should be other ways to say that not maximal pressure. I don't think that's going to work with the Palestinians. They're too locked into their self-definition about the defiance.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're at the top of the hour. We can take one more brief question.
Thank you. So we'll move to our last question.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead. Your line is open.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. David, Dennis, it's rare that I disagree with you, and it's rare that I've found anyone more focused on this area. But I did have the pleasure of sitting through the announcement and then going to briefings. In fact, I think your brother, David, was one of them as well. And this is a totally different paradigm. And I think that what you're not taking into consideration is that you're viewing it through your book or through history. This is a new chapter, like Trump and everything about him, whether you like him or not. This is different. And I think it would be a terrible mistake not to go ahead with annexation. Annexation is creating a large block. It's not annexation in the sense that we've talked about it before. It's an opportunity during the next 4 years for the Arab community, for the Palestinians, to adopt an enormous block of land, which is contiguous, while at the same time allowing the Israelis to have sovereignty over all of of every part of Judea and Samaria. It ensures that even the strangest outpost that's in the middle of no place will not be uprooted. The notion that you mentioned about 230,000 Arabs having the choice, they're not uprooted under this plan. In fact, they're guaranteed not to be uprooted, and they can certainly opt to stay where they are. And so I think it's a totally different paradigm, and I think it has to be recognized as such. I sat through it, and as you know, the UAE was present.
Sir, do you have a question, sir?
Yes, I do. do you see this? Well, it's simple. It's a real simple question. Isn't this a change in the whole dynamic of what we've ever seen before, and doesn't it have to be evaluated from that perspective?
Well, look, let me give a quick answer, and David can respond too. Is it a totally different paradigm? Absolutely, it is. And it has a couple of key assumptions to it. One of which is that Palestinians needed to adjust their expectations downward, and they also needed to understand that they could lose even more. Better for them to agree to this or get nothing at all. So it is a totally different paradigm. What the two of us are trying to suggest is, if you annex now, you're going to lose the Arabs. And when you lose the Arabs, you'll end up probably isolating the U.S. and Israel, not isolating the Palestinians. We would like to keep the possibility of what is presented with this plan alive by not losing the Arabs. If you have the Arabs, ultimately, in time, you will affect the Palestinians. What David was saying earlier is exactly right. The Palestinians, the whole national movement has been characterized by defiance. And the problem with defiance and victimhood, each of those become kind of self-fulfilling prophecies that keep them a victim and keep them defiant. The new paradigm is basically trying to say, okay, but you'll lose by that. The fact that the Arabs are not lining up behind them gives you potential leverage on them that you've never had, because they'll be alone. Annexation puts that at risk. The president himself said this is a 4-year timetable. So what's the rush of annexation? You know you're going to get that territory anyway. That's what's in the plan.
But the president,
so why rush to annex?
No, because as you say, things on the ground. Thank
you, Dennis. Ladies and gentlemen, we're at the top of the hour. It's now 5 o'clock, and I'd like to thank Dennis and David for taking the time out of their schedules to answer our questions here. I want to thank the trustees for supporting the work of the Institute. Dennis, David, do you have any final thoughts?
I just want to say one last point. Is that what you're...
Sir, I'm sorry. We're ending the call, sir. Sorry. Dennis, David?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, what you're hearing from Dennis and me is that we want to give this plan a chance. In a very highly polarized world, we are not among those critics who say, oh, it wasn't the way we knew it, so therefore it can't be good. That's not our approach at all. The other approaches didn't work. So we're saying is just give this approach a chance. And we think annexation diminishes the chances of this plan being able to take off at this time. If Israel has the annexation in its pocket, it has time on its side. And so therefore it doesn't need to rush. So our view is let this plan play out. Let the leverage play out of the Arab states on Israel's side and on America's side for a change. It's a great asset, and it can only increase our leverage. And let's keep going in that direction and not do self-inflicted wounds. That's all.